What is the future of real-time strategy games? A question asked almost every day, and my answer is, let's first take a look at the past and present of RTS game development. After that, together we can guess and hope on what the future will bring. Today I will give you not just my personal take on this, but also quotes from some of the indie developers I have talked to on this subject and the difficulties they struggle with. So, a long time ago, in what feels like an alternate Earth at this point, there were small, unknown companies making RTS games which would become giants as we remember them today, rose-colored glasses or otherwise. Westwood Studio, Ensemble Studio, Blizzard Entertainment, Gas-Powered Games, Relic Entertainment, Massive Entertainment, Petroglyph Games, Ironclad Games, Big Huge Games, Creative Assembly, and some others I'm sure you can add to the list. These were the companies and the people behind them which started it all, or moved the genre forward by leaps and bounds. Today many are gone, or don't exist as before past the name on the front door. They are our collective past, but who is the present?
Am I the only one freaked out by the fact we're inside the planets?
It is on the subject of real-time strategy games and indie development, as well as my personal experience with the genre for the past 25 years, that I wanted to share a few words with you all here, no matter if you're a gamer, developer, or publisher. In addition to that, I'm going to quote several indie developers who shared with me their own thoughts about projects they are working on and their impressions of the current state of RTS game development, along with descriptions of what they are struggling with the most. Of these, I think one line speaks the ultimate truth everyone can agree on, and I received it from Flight Fight who works on Assembly RTS. He says, "As a solo indie developer, the greatest hurdle has been making meaningful progress within a reasonable amount of time." But why should you even care what I have to say? Maybe a bit of background would help. Back in the golden days of RTS gaming, I was in elementary school, starting to play strategy games like Red Alert and Dune 2000 on my PlayStation 1, earning my nickname Paraphilosoph, which in English means Peter the Philosopher. Soon after, I played Age of Empires on my friend's PC for the first time and promptly rushed my parents to buy me a PC. Today, I run this YouTube channel dedicated to strategy games on PC, which is actually a paying hobby for me. But more importantly, I use this as a way to connect to both players and developers of RTS games and talk to them on a daily basis. On my own Discord, gamers and developers exchange their ideas and observations, and I feel proud to be part of this discussion. If you want to join us, the link is in the description. Besides all this, I have a run-of-the-mill day job like many of you, and not unlike many indie developers I have come to know over the years. And I also have a wife and a son who I hope to teach the joys of RTS gaming. Since we are all here because in some way we have a connection to real-time strategy games, I want to continue by saying RTS games are not dead. But they aren't doing stellar either. This is actually a line I used in one of my most viewed video lists of upcoming RTS games, and it still resonates very strongly in my mind 2 years after I originally said it in that video. This is because in my daily dealings with RTS fans, indie and well-known developers, fellow content creators, and even a few publishers, the struggle of the genre, which is about 30 years past its golden age, is quite evident. The most obvious problem to me, and basically every indie dev out there, is the lack of funding for RTS games. And the root cause for that, at least in my eyes, is simply low return on such an investment. And I'm not alone in thinking so, as one of the developers of Abilite explains. Probably the biggest hurdle of them all for indie games: funding. If your team size is already super small, it's simply impossible to create a high-quality RTS game in your free time, So everyone needs to be full-time, and even if it's just a small team of a few people, that gets expensive. Life is expensive. People have families, kids to feed, bills to pay. It gets very expensive over a development time of 4 to 5 years. And additional costs of music, voice acting, localization, etc. And you end up with funding, especially these days, truly being the number one obstacle to overcome. And why do investors find it so hard to even consider RTS games? There is this famous example made by one of Blizzard's ex-developers who explained that a $15 horse mount microtransaction in World of Warcraft made more money for their company than the first part of StarCraft 2. And in the true capitalist fashion, money flows where it grows. With this simple example, I think we can all understand why practically no AAA company funds real-time strategy game development, and why there hasn't been a Warcraft 4, for example, even after 20 plus years. And honestly, even if there was, there is no one left in that company who could make a sequel worthy of the Warcraft brand, something the terrible remasters of the past 3 Warcraft games have already shown. Unfortunately, it is the same case with basically every other RTS AAA game developer that hasn't been closed down, evident by the disaster known as Homeworld 3. But before my frustration gets the best of me, let me point you to something interesting that happens as we move down the mountain of money which these AAA game companies are sitting on. Mid-sized game publishers which sell far fewer copies of their games but which have old and hardcore RTS fans still fund and publish such games in much higher numbers than the AAA ones. And if we slide down to the very bottom, where indie developers live on one thin line of money, which is all that separates them from bankruptcy or hunger or homelessness, we find hundreds of RTS games in development. This, in fact, is recognized by multiple developers I have talked to, like those at Lendl Games who are making the game Apotheos, and say, there are many fierce competitors vying for a smaller market share in the indie space. It can be quite difficult to stand out among some truly awesome projects. A big obstacle is being seen and heard in the sweeping world of amazing RTS projects being developed, in particular within the ecosystem of smaller, passionate devs. And not only I agree with him, but another indie dev team called Fennec, who just published their own RTS game titled Rogue Command. This is what they said on the subject. It's just really hard to get eyes and by extension wishlists and I guess sales later on your game. The field of new games has gotten so wide, and I think that, especially with indie games, but AAA ones too, with certain very prominent outliers, the quality has also gotten to a really amazing point. So standing out even with a really good game, there is no guarantee that you can make it work as a sustainable business. After thinking about this current situation and by following this trail of money down to the level of the struggling indie developers, I found myself finally understanding what happened not just to the RTS genre, but to gaming in general. In my view, about 30 years ago, the then active development and publishing companies opened the gates and let in the multinational corporations. These were, are, and always will be only profit-driven, and the gaming business was swallowed up in one bite then and there. Now, many years later, they are being slowly digested and broken down to their constituent parts until only well-oiled and polished money-printing machines come out the other end. Real-time strategy games were simply never compatible with the business practices of multinational corporations, as they don't have the parts required to become these money-printing machines. This is why you have so much strife between biggest RTS game developers and publishers, like we saw recently with Relic Entertainment and Sega, Creative Assembly and again Sega, Blizzard and Activision, just to name a few examples. So to conclude this first point, As is true in so many other fields, just follow the money and you get your answers. Before I continue with the main topic of the video, I want to take a moment and pass on some thoughts from indie developers working right now to bring you new RTS games. Here is what they had to say when I asked them about the biggest hurdles for indie developers such as themselves and how they plan to bring something different to the table. From the founder of the Lundell Games Studio. We don't aim to create just another RTS game. There are already countless examples of that. Instead, our goal is to breathe new life into the genre while adding our unique twist: massive epic battles. To enhance the nostalgic feel, our Kickstarter campaign will offer a physical copy of the game, CD, DVD or USB, delivering the ultimate retro experience. This is a real challenge for us. How can we pay tribute to the masterpieces of the past and the work that has already been done, while redefining the genre without purely commercial motives? You can tell he has some interesting ideas and wants to capitalize on this hook he believes will help his game stand a bit taller than the rest and capture your interest. Another developer, this one making Tactical Combat Operations Desert Storm, talks about his own personal struggle of time versus money. One of the biggest hurdles I have faced as an indie dev is time. Sure, getting a publisher, marketing, etc. are challenging, but time is the real killer. It's what makes your game or product valuable, not just for buyers, but for creators too. You pour endless hours into learning tools, solving problems, and building your vision. But if the project fails, or something unexpected happens, like in my case becoming a parent, it can knock you off track completely. Time never comes back. You learn, but you're constantly stuck with the uncertainty of whether it will all pay off in today's world. Alright. Now that we know where most of the main RTS game development happens and where it has almost stopped, I can talk about how important it is for indie developers to become better at networking, not just with each other, but with potential investors and publishers. This is one of the ways for them to cut their costs, both in time and money. There is one publisher in particular which I would like to mention, as I was there alongside them as they started to work in this field under the name Hooded Horse, and quickly grew due to a very meticulous process of betting on the best horses, games, and reinvested those profits to support those projects and developers which might have looked less safe to begin with. I reached out to their CEO, Tim Bender, for a comment on this topic, and he responded with the following: "We are lucky to have had the chance to work with so many amazing developers. Theirs is the love and dedication that goes into the years it takes to build and balance a great game, and we are honored each time we are entrusted to help a game find its audience." But while such publishers are a fantastic opportunity for indie developers to stop working on the thin line of financial failure, not everyone can get such a leg up. This leads to many indie developers wasting huge amounts of time and money by starting from zero on so many aspects of game development and publishing. I have had to start connecting indie devs who I know are proficient at dealing with Steam's digital distribution systems to those who I see aren't knowledgeable about this, as I simply couldn't keep watching them struggle with something that is an obstacle they can jump over so easily if only they had a helping hand and a 15-minute Discord conversation. I must have talked to several hundred indie developers in the last few years, and every time it is the same story, at least on average depending on their background. They start learning programming, game engines and all the other elements of development, and just when they think they have some semblance of understanding, they realize they know next to nothing about finding investors, marketing, digital distribution platforms, opening a limited liability company, and 100 other things that come up between having an idea to make a game and publishing one. To be honest, I know very little about these things myself, and everything I know I learned because someone else took valuable time out of their day to teach me. But this is exactly why indie developers need to provide a helping hand to each other and save themselves mountains of sweat and probably a few buckets of tears along the way. Another important segment of game development they can help each other with is realizing how much time and money is required to bring their current vision for the game into fruition. Because too often indie developers have grand plans and they jump in headfirst into a huge project that eats their time like an abyss, only to realize years later they can't finish this monster they have put so much sweat and tears into because they bit off far more than they could chew. This is something the developer of Heart of Muria told me about when we talked about game scope and quality. He stated first this premise: I need to add this feature, otherwise the game can't compete. But then explained to me what happens if this is how you frame your game development. With thousands of great games out there, how can a solo dev compete? You must feel pressured to be in the top 5-10% of games, which means quality and scope increase every year you are not releasing. The key is having the courage to leave gaps. Otherwise, the game may never see the light of day. I had a nice discussion on my Discord with both gamers and developers on this subject, and many agree that setting realistic, small-scale goals for the game's features first and moving up from there after a successful launch is the only safe way for indie game development. Otherwise, feature creep and bloatware end up stretching an overtasked indie dev too thin and nothing gets done, wasting both the idea and developer's time he can never get back. Now, one important aspect of game development, especially moving forward in 2025, is going to be using AI. This is another tool which can save them a lot of time, and despite not being popular with the audience, I know it is becoming more and more popular with the people who create content for gamers to consume, meaning both game developers and gaming content creators. And this is okay in my book, as long as it's not the AI generated content that is being sold, but work developers put in while using AI tools. I know the distinction might be hard to make, but if you think about it long enough, I think you can spot examples easily in games sold today. And when you listen to what the developers of Abelite have to say on the subject of indie game development, it is no wonder many turn to AI tools. Making an RTS like Abelite is hard. It's quite frankly one of the hardest genres of games to develop, from pathfinding, unit avoidance to networking with hundreds of agents being moved at the same time, the custom fog of war, all the minor details that an RTS just needs to get right in order to be good. It's hard. It's already incredibly hard if you have a team of 200 people and tens of millions of dollars at your disposal. So doing it with a team of 5 or 10 people and a very limited budget is madness. But here we are. The last topic I feel I need to talk about is the current situation of how indie developers search for funding for their RTS game projects. As more and more of these I find, the more I see a pattern emerging. A talented individual has an idea. They already have or learned the know-how necessary to create a prototype for that idea while sacrificing their own time and money. Then they try to find an investor or publisher who will fund that idea until it is ready to be published. But here they usually hit a brick wall because they lack two things these investors or publishers want to see: public interest in the game, basically hype, and the potential for a return on such an investment. Because without followers on Twitter, I will never call it X, or Discord members, or a huge number of wishlists on Steam, these investors don't see enough public interest in the game, meaning, in their eyes, there is a small potential audience. Here the developer of Assembly RTS pitched in with his own thoughts on the subject. Another thing I found challenging is marketing. Unless your game is visually outstanding or designed with virality in mind, it can be difficult to gain traction. Lots of game developers suggest marketing your game as early on as possible. My personal experience has been to the contrary. I think marketing a game that isn't already far in development must often be impractical for solo developers. Whereas big studios simply produce completely fake or semi-fake gameplay showcases early in development, indie developers usually don't have that option. I have spent a lot of man-hours trying to make Assembly RTS more appealing from a marketing standpoint, even though the game has been lacking essential features. For example, I've added particle effects into the game, making it look more attractive, even though I knew I would have to replace it with a better solution later on. In hindsight, it would have been more ideal to keep my focus on the essential features of the game instead. It can be a really tricky dilemma to decide when to start showing off your game. As for the return on investment, this is the second important metric, which is usually something that these investors are capable of recognizing from experience or by asking consultants. Their profit margins are usually a bar which is too high for indie developers to jump over, or by the time they have a game which looks and plays good enough, they might as well publish it on their own, if they have any money left. In the end, you have a mountain of work done for very few and far between success stories when it comes to lone indie developers or small teams of them. This is why I feel like the indie developers of today are equal to the AAA developers of the past, just on smaller scale. And if they could be helped to consolidate, and instead of 300 indie games made by 300 individual developers, present the market with 30 new games made by 10 new studios, they would be investors lining up to offer them funds. This, of course, leaves a big problem. How do you align 10 developers with different visions into one cohesive dev team? It is definitely not my area of expertise, but I would love to read your comments below. I must admit that when I started explaining the tactics of multiplayer battles in Shogun 2 Total War more than 10 years ago in my very first videos on YouTube, I never envisioned a future in which I'm spending hours of my day trying to guide new indie developers on a path others have already been over many times before. And yet here I am, talking to you about a genre that might just have a new golden age, which happens to coincide with the game development business basically starting over, as previous giants topple over after being eaten up inside by corporate greed. And to those middle ground game development studios and publishers that managed to survive this period with only minor concessions or consequences, like Ironclad Games, Eugene Systems, Stardock, Microprose, Petroglyphs, Slytherin, I can only say keep it up and don't let us down. If you have some of your own favorite developers and publishers who still make good games and publish them as we are used to with no cut content to be sold later as DLCs, do tell me so in the comments below. I hope the future is as bright as I see it and that I will be able to bring you many more RTS games and their success stories in my future videos. Thank you for watching and happy gaming!